Hello everyone, today we talk about the dynastic union of the Hohenstaufen with the Hauteville of Sicily. One of the most important marriages of the High Middle Ages, arguably, comparing with the one of Henry II of England with Eleanor of Aquitaine. It's one of those great history-changing events. Through this unions, really the history of Europe could have been radically different, as well as at that point, and the world one naturally as a consequence. We're talking about full feudal Europe at this time, so this idea that these great domains, even kingdoms, etc., were fundamentally not really a private property on an institutional point of view, but that could in fact be inherited by the monarchs in such a fashion is definitely important to understand, because it influenced the strategical balance internationally in such an important measure. Now, the event in itself can be naturally told, the various marriage in the marriage in Milan, the courting, but it's important to tell really a lot about the background, which is really what is very meaningful. I mean, how did the Dukes of Swabia, now also kings of Germany and Holy Roman Emperors, manage to acquire this extremely large and powerful kingdom in the Mediterranean, and not just on which basis, because also the marriage in itself wasn't enough, in terms of strictly dynastic reasons. There were different perceptions in the way this kingdom was acquired, both from actually the Swabians and the same Hauteville in the end, but especially also from the side of the papacy, that at this point was pretty much troubled because of this union, as we will see, and try to essentially exploit certain other other events, such as the minority of the young Frederick II, in order to arrange the asset in another fashion. So, first of all, talking about this kingdom, how was the kingdom of Sicily founded back in the day, and why now was there in this dynastic crisis that brought into this marriage with the Swabians? Well, substantially, the kingdom of Sicily is kind of a very peculiar kingdom on its own. I made a video about, now I forgot about it, about the kingdom, that if you give me 1 second, I'm gonna tell you which one it is. And there are not many videos about it on YouTube. In fact, the first thing I find absurd is how much this kingdom is neglected, as it was one, after France, England, and Castile. Even this was definitely the most important kingdom in Europe at the time, as well as its institutional system was the most centralized in all Latin Germanic Europe. So it's a very big chapter of European history that I see nobody is even minimally considering. So I have made I made several of these. I made a video on the significance of the Norman conquest of Sicily, the Norman Sicily management of a Mediterranean empire, Norman Kingdom of Sicily, a unique monarchy. So these videos are useful kind of for an introduction. For now, I will repeat just what eventually was meaningful to in the legal practice now for the inheritance of the kingdom in itself. So fundamentally, the kingdom of Sicily was born from the conquests of the Hauteville dynasty in what would be the southern Italian peninsula, when Sicily was still into the hands of the Arabs. So the Normans had arrived there fundamentally as contractors. They worked as mercenaries, to defend usually the pilgrims along the road for for the Holy Land. Southern Italy had these major ports that were used to reach the Palestine and the holy places, and substantially they rose to power into Southern Italy, exploiting this very fragmented situation that existed previously to, in fact, their unification of all this territory that for the first time, in fact, brought, after centuries of fragmentation, to a sort of political unity. And they had risen initially, I would say, against the papacy. The papacy, not because they had anything about it. The Normans, by the way, at this time were not the Vikings at all. We're talking about Normans in the context of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. The term Norman is a synecdoche. Most of them, just like the Hauteville, were French Normans. I mean, of course, kind of the adjective French is kind of debatable, but you know, that's the idea. They came from the Western Frankish Kingdom. They spoke French. They were, you know, they had fully absorbed the Frankish feudalism fundamentally, and they, albeit there were so many other adventurers that had joined them, you know, that even during the Norman conquest of England, there weren't just Normans from Normandy. There were also Bretons, Flemish, and other people that came from somewhere. So even the term Norman in here is kind of relatively, you know, an approximation. However, the papacy initially was fundamentally very troubled by the rise of the Normans, because he didn't want at its borders this new powerful domain that was being structured, and also because the Pope at the time already had enough troubles on its own to kind of get rid of the Holy Roman Imperial influence on its affairs, on the Roman affairs. So initially, the papacy was against the Normans. It was even defeated famously in 1053 at the Battle of Civitate, where the papal army, together with German mercenaries, was in fact wiped out by the Normans. There was also a moment in which, in fact, the Pope was kidnapped by the Normans. It was very strained relations, at the end of which, basically, the popes have this brilliant idea at that point to tie the Normans to them. Given that they couldn't get rid of them at that point, they decide to entrust them fully not just these territories of the southern Italy, of the Italian peninsula, but also of perspecting them the acceptance and the fundamentally the concession in feudal relation with the papacy as a dominus, fundamentally, of the yet to be conquered island of Sicily. So that's how, between the 50s and the 70s, the Normans invade Muslim Sicily, conquer it, wipe out the Muslim presence. Many Muslims basically came back to Tunisia, others remained, but fundamentally this the island was incorporated into these Norman domains, and even though the kingdom was institutionally created later, several generations later, the Normans at that point, the Hauteville dynasty, had acquired all of this big and extremely rich, actually, land of the Mediterranean. You know that Sicily is an extremely fertile land, historically speaking. It exported grain, now it fed the whole Italy, and it exported even beyond. The same southern, the peninsular territories were also pretty florid, especially Apulia. There were also many cities. It was a region of ancient urbanization, very well strategically located for what it concerned, you know, reaching the Holy Land, accessing the Byzantine Empire. That's why, in fact, the Normans start, you know, the first thing they start to do with their main strategic aim is to invade the Byzantine Empire and take Constantinople. They arrive in the 12th century to sack even Thessalonica. It was the second city of the empire, etc. So a huge power that the Pope at that point had framed under its control, at least formally, as a feudal concession that the Pope by himself had created for the Normans. This established very important relations because at that point the Normans were more or less allies with Rome. I say more or less because sometimes there were even moments of open conflict. The Normans at one point even came to pillage Rome, just for instance, normal things that happened in the Middle Ages. But nevertheless, there was always this bond and this relation that naturally was pretty useful for both the powers involved, because the Pope gave this, the legitimizing authority to the Normans into the southern lands. It was a kind of a personal relations, and this is probably the most important thing in relation in turn with the Holy Roman Empire, because the Holy Roman Empire, we will see now, when the Henry VI married Constance of Hauteville, the heiress of the Sicilian kingdom. He was stressing as Holy Roman Emperor, especially against the Pope, because he didn't care much, in fact, about the Siculo-Normans in this sense, this regard. A sort of ancient privilege that existed in theory as a Holy Roman Emperor, as a master of those lands, as a ruler of those lands, because this, formally speaking, the Holy Roman Empire was was theoretically meant to be the universal empire. When you look at the maps of Europe and during this time that we have drawn, there is this Holy Roman Empire that more or less encompasses the modern day Germany, northern and central Italy, including the Papal States, because the Papal States formerly were within the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, and that's what all also the clash for investitures and the problem of the imperial crowning, the importance of the Italic crown was really about. And that's how what basically the history of Europe revolved around for at least between the 9th, the 8th, and the 14th century. But and also parts of like Burgundy, Bohemia, etc. So roughly, also certain French-speaking areas, but certain other Slavic-speaking areas, and it fundamentally looks from this map as if this was in fact a sort of entity on its own that was on equal grounds fundamentally with the others, like the Kingdom of France or other kingdoms that exist out there. I don't know, Kingdom of Poland, Denmark, even Spain, that is from all another side of Europe. But the concept at the time was still that the Holy Roman Emperor was emperor of the whole Western Christianity, at least. So it was a universal title. Therefore, when we look at those maps, we don't have to think that the imperial authority was really stopping to those borders that we watch. Usually, the Holy Roman Empire is painted in black on kind of dark colors, and it doesn't stop with where that color is, because theoretically, the Holy Roman Empire has a legitimacy all over. I mean, it only encompasses, ideally, the whole Western Christendom. So, and this is why, for instance, I don't know, the French kings or the Spanish kings at one point even tried to be elected emperors. Some even succeeding. Think about Alfonso of Castile, for instance, who was king of the Romans, really, perhaps not really Holy Roman Emperor, I don't remember, but just for saying that there was this idea that, however, albeit in fact the authority of the German kings extended more or less all around that area. I say more or less because basically the German monarchy never reached to extend all over the Kingdom of Germany. It was not like France or England that already were pretty much troubled, especially France, up to a certain point, to extend its control actually all over the land that encompassed. The Kingdom of Germany was elected. There was always a very unfavorable balance, and ultimately the German monarchy failed to create a central system with a national monarchy, just like in these other kingdoms in the West. But the problem with Sicily in this sense was that it was a land that was created, let's say, actively. It was the most recent monarchy in Europe, fundamentally, by this time. And it had been created, fundamentally, on behalf of the papacy. So it was the Pope who literally said, go take Sicily. And Sicily was not even a Christian land. It had been Muslim. Of course, there were Christians, and there were also, a wide variety. In the south of Italy, there were fundamentally Catholics, I'd say Roman Rite Christians, Greek, Eastern Rite Christians, Jews, Muslims. It was all, a very complex situation. And this, by the way, was also played very cleverly by the Normans in order to build a sort of balance within all of these communities to basically not to make a major one prevail. There was also the problem of the barons. This idea that the Kingdom of Sicily was also particularly centralized. It is true. I mean, compared to the rest of Latin Germanic Europe, it was the most centralized, and I would say even efficient. Maybe not so, but the main competitor in there is the Norman Kingdom of England, and it's very interesting in this sense to observe that the most functional feudal monarchies of this time were the ones created by the Normans in Sicily and in England, and that this, however, still passed through a feudal system, so that even though there were certain central institutions, still the way these kingdoms fundamentally worked was through, vassalic beneficiary relations with certain barons who were entrusted large chunks of land. If you study the history of southern Italy in detail, you see how the Normans basically built up this. When they conquered this land, they built up. They don't wipe out the nobility that already existed, because it would have been impossible. But they start creating these immense estates that were meant, in fact, to, in a fully feudal fashion, to provide this feudal retinues, this mounted military elite that only through such a large amount of properties concentrated in the hands of a very few could be obtained. But the problem, as we were saying, is that fundamentally the Kingdom of Sicily, just like a bit the Kingdom of England, if you think about it, and partially the Iberian monarchies. Of course, there are also the Eastern European ones, etc. But fundamentally speaking, it was in a very central position, and it was created out of the blue. It didn't belong to the original Carolingian kingdoms, like the Kingdom of France, of Italy, or in Germany. It was something on its own, and therefore it also, the Normans played very much with this also in England. The idea that England was, in the case of England, it's particularly evident because the English kings remained fundamentally French vassals of the French king, as dukes of Normandy. So in that case, there was even the complication that there was a vassal that was still technically a vassal of the French king in that case. Whereas the Anglo-Norman dynasty considered England as a prize of war, fundamentally, their own conquest, something that belonged to them because they had won it through the right of arms, fundamentally. Well, with southern Italy was fundamentally the same thing, with the addition that the only feudal authority to which the Normans were tied was the papacy. That is not really a feudal authority like all the others. By the way, there is also to consider that while the French monarchy was kind of powerful, the Holy Roman Empire, because in spite of all its problems, was also still kind of powerful, the papacy was not really much. I mean, aside from its ideological weapons, at this time the popes really control just really the region around Rome and something else, but they don't have such a solidly structured domain. It's just in this 12th and 13th century that the popes really begin to build something more consistent under really an administrative point of view, and this will evolve, however, still very slowly also in the following centuries. So the Normans are kind of a bit suspended in this area. They're considered. They weren't. Nobody actually. I don't know really in detail about the whole story, but I think that none of the Holy Roman Emperors had fundamentally claimed that the Siculo-Norman kingdom to be their own. First of all, because there was this feudal, I would say, convention that fundamentally recognized the rights of conquest. At that point, the Normans were being also papal vassals. They had this kind of privileged status on their own. But the Normans in southern Italy were considered a bit something different, even by the French, by the Germans, that passed there for going to the Crusades, because they thought they were kind of poulain, bastards, people who had conquered this land that was so magic and mysterious, that had previously been Muslim, that in fact had drawn so much from the local Islamic and Byzantine administrative practices. They were so deeply involved also in the relation with non-Christian powers. The Normans of Sicily at this time had extended partly also sort of vassalage over the Tunisian and Libyan coasts. They were in the first line, even during the Crusades. The Principality of Antioch was fundamentally a belonging of the Hauteville, dynastically speaking. They also were pretty much in contact with the Byzantines. They were, generally speaking, the same competitor of the Holy Roman Empire into Italy, because fundamentally the papacy, and this is also the other bigger chunk of the story, had tried always to create this balance into the peninsula, fragmenting, dividing, and putting one against the other in order to survive as the relatively weak military power, at least that it was in there, obviously still being enormously politically and ideologically influenced, as you can imagine. That's a bit the story of the Italian peninsula ever since the Longobards conquest. Fundamentally, the popes tried to divide, to obstacle every kind of ruler that existed in the peninsula, not to make it take the control over the whole land. Just incidentally, the other day we were talking about Aistulf, king of the Longobards, and that's where, in fact, the papacy for the first time called the Franks into Italy, so aborting the final conquest of the whole peninsula by the hand of the Longobards. And it's a bit like that, historically speaking, at all times. It happened later with the Angevins. It happened because and here we are, because essentially at this point there were always these powers that had tried to reunite fundamentally central and northern and southern Italy into a unique domain. Why? Well, because Italy was really the wealthiest land in you can argue in the world at the time. So the point though is it was dramatically divided from a political point of view. So what's the best what's the best goal to the best prey at that point? That's where you go. With the only problem that in fact every kind of conqueror that arrived there kind of got bogged down in one way or another. And into this dynamic, it was mostly the papacy that also played a very important role, because the papacy didn't want to be strangled fundamentally by from the north and from the south together, and therefore always kind of tried to keep these entities separated and turning one against the other when one became too powerful, and they wanted to weaken it in order not to make him prevail. And there were so many actors at this point. I mean, Italy at this point was contended by everyone, by the empire, by the communes that wanted to be left alone, by the Normans, by the Byzantines that also intervened. At this time, the French are still not have still not arrived on the Mediterranean, but eventually it will happen. In fact, with the Angevins that will arrive in the 13th century, called by the Pope exactly to crush the Sicilian kingdom, the heirs of the Hohenstaufen, and so this is really the bigger picture. In telling the truth, Holy Roman Empire and Norman Kingdom Sicily had not really liked each other much historically. They fundamentally didn't have much in common. The Kingdom of Sicily was a well-rooted kingdom on its own. It had this extremely privileged situation. It was well administered. What do they care about the Germans? That were fundamentally all divided. Every once in a while, the emperors arrived and tried to in northern Italy and tried to subdue this land, and it was a hell of an effort. Therefore, it was relatively easy to make it fail just by intervening into the matter. So tendentially, that they had not liked the Germans much anymore. It's not that because they were German, and I'm sorry, I don't want to make it a national thing. I mean, it's still dynastic. At this time, dynastic matters are really much more important than any kind of identity or local identity. And this is what this marriage and its cause that we'll also try to explain, because it's not really known, historiographically speaking, was probably about. From the other side, the Swabians, let's say better at this point, the Hohenstaufen, were at this time they were actually the greatest power in Europe, especially before the Battle of Leniano. They had almost made it to rebuild a sort of Western Empire. They had a huge power. Everything that was happening in Europe and the Mediterranean was based on the essentially what the Hohenstaufen were doing in terms of relations, etc. And it was extremely important. The Hohenstaufen had risen, as most of the Holy Roman Imperial dynasties, from a relatively quickly and from relatively secondary positions. This is the case basically of everyone, especially at this time, and had managed, however, to create fundamentally a consistent power. It was fundamentally grounded into southern Germany. In Swabia, it was naturally the homeland of the dynasty, and also other parts of southeastern Germany that were kind of more siding in with at least also southeastern Germany was kind of divided, but overall the Swabians tried to build eventually their power around this area, chiefly because it was close to the Alps. So since their major goal was to invade Italy and to create an empire, to reshift basically the base of the empire in there, that's what it was vital for. If you're more interested about the Hohenstaufen, I created just recently a dedicated playlist to them, because I discussed them kind of enough at this point, and I will keep doing it. Also, this video will go into that playlist, so if you're interested about them, there is not much in the internet about them, so on YouTube at least, sorry, and therefore you will most likely stumble into my videos if you search for them. And they had this immediate goal that actually all the Transalpine emperors had always had. That was, in fact, to conquer Italy. The main objective of every Holy Roman Imperial dynasty up to the 14th century, where the central power is so weak that it was useful to go into Italy once again, was to conquer the peninsula. And not only, but to shift the center of imperial power in there. I mean, the objective of individuals like Otto III or Frederick II was really literally to rule from Rome. And in this picture, Germany would have been just a peripheral province of the empire. That was the real center. That's where they wanted to rule from, because there was Rome, which was the symbol of the empire, the center of Western Christianity. It was in the Mediterranean. It was fertile. From there you could hope to retake Constantinople, the holy places. It was all about that. I mean, the history of the Middle Ages, of the full Middle Ages, really revolve all around this desperate need for the Holy Roman Emperors to seize Italy and to make it the center of their empire. If you don't get this point, you can't get half of medieval history, basically, and you have always to bear it in mind. So, as you understand, the Siculo-Norman kingdom kind of stood in the way a little bit, not really geographically, because as we have seen, we have seen that the Holy Roman Empire fundamentally stopped into central Italy, with the Papal States that were comprehended into it. Then these southern lands had not belonged to the empire, and they had always, however, been craved by the German emperors. You realize that everyone who went into Italy at one point from the north tried to invade southern Italy as well. If he had managed to kind of control the north, the cities of the north, the papacy with Rome, the main goal was to seize southern Italy for the reasons that we have remembered. Fertile area, good ports, access to the whole Mediterranean, and generally speaking, lots of resources added to it. This is something that everybody tried, at least. Charlemagne tried to invade the Duchy of Benevent, for instance, at the time. There were still the Longobards. The Ottonians campaigned pretty intensely into southern Italy. The same Carolingians of Italy actually sent, after Charlemagne, during the time of Ludwig II, sent, even successful military, successful invasions of certain Saracens avamposts into southern Italy. The Ottonians suffered a terrible defeat at the hands of the Saracens in Calabria. In fact, even the Salian emperors had been fighting now against the Normans in order to take them away to the south. So that's what the Hohenstaufen now were really trying to do. The Hohenstaufen hadn't been so actually involved into southern Italy because their main problem at that point in this stage of development of the Italian cities was to fight against the Lombard communes that were really the toughest nut to crack, and they were also the ones that fundamentally made the whole universalistic plan fail, because they managed to halt this the Hohenstaufen, and especially after the Battle of Legnano, this enormous Swabian system that encompassed huge parts of Europe suffers a very massive breakdown, from which actually the Swabians managed to recover, also thanks to the marriage with the Hauteville, but fundamentally that was their main problem. So that's the reason why eventually the Germans hadn't reached the south of Italy. As we will see now in the story, there were also other powers that were not the Swabians but their rivals, the Welfen, that despite some nationalistic historiography in Germany said they were mostly concerned about the true Germany that didn't venture into the Mediterranean. It was useless according to them, etc. Actually, even Otto of Brunswick, the first thing that he does when he sees as a Saxon the imperial throne, fundamentally he invades southern Italy. So that was the main goal, because there has been a lot of debate whether this was the best option, whether to concentrate all of these resources, to spend consume all these resources for seizing Italy instead and strengthening the monarchy into Germany. Well, it was definitely worth it, and the proof is that literally everybody did it, and there is also a quite evident demonstration of this if you understand what how really on what was power really grounded at this time. We sense sometimes as if these were nation states of the 19th century where there is a strictly territorial definition of power, and therefore where you see borders, you see that's the core of power. Not really. At this time, power was grounded naturally on estates, on feudal. The Swabians had risen fundamentally thanks to those ones, just like any other imperial dynasty. But their power was mostly based on their capability of projection into, in fact, this great space in Europe, and the capability of reaching Italy, of interacting with the papacy, having fundamentally carrying out a truly imperial policy that could engage and co-opt as many subjects, as nominal subjects as possible. And it was never at this point really still the idea that, I don't know, this chunk of land is opposed to this other chunk of land. It was mostly, this community has these interests and it's still part of the system, still part of the empire, etc., but wants more or less privileges and fights for it, and that's really it. It was mostly something much more strictly, it was still based on wealth, as you can imagine, but it has a much less territorial ground than we can imagine. In fact, we can find throughout all this medieval history this sometimes this very brutal shifts between one era or another. After why was the Battle of Legnano so important? It was not much because of the defeat in itself, but it was left aside that it was difficult to recover power. In terms also of manpower, fundamentally, and also all the money was left. You can think the economical potential at this time was very low, so even a great defeat like that could change things forever. But even in the case of the Hohenstaufen, you realize that they basically recovered from that victory, from that defeat quite quickly. By the way, I made a video on the Battle of Legnano. It's one of the few battles that I randomly discussed, so if you're interested into that, I can search the title for you. It should simply be the Battle of Legnano. The Battle of Legnano, May the 29th, 1176. And there are also other videos I made into the Hohenstaufen playlist. The one on Frederick Barbarossa, Clash with the Lombard League, and Harry the Lion. I've discussed this thing, so if you're interested, you can find more material in there. So the idea was, however, that the Hohenstaufen were kept to watch to the Mediterranean, even after Legnano, even after this major readjustment, this shrinking of their power. So the Siculo-Norman kingdom was in the way for obvious reasons, because if you want fundamentally to reunite East and West, you have to pass through Mediterranean. And from the German side, you have to pass from the Western Mediterranean, and guess who is that controls the Western Mediterranean at that point? The Kingdom of Sicily. So that was the major goal. In order to achieve this grand strategy of reunion of the two empires, it was enough not to reconquer all the whole West. The Germans never thought to invade England or to invade France, or Spain. They didn't care. It was enough for them at the time to extend a decent control on the princes of Germany. Then go down into Italy, trying to curb this local communes and getting, support at least from some of the best, the strongest maritime republics. There were Genoa and Pisa, that in fact also for certain internal reasons were at this time Ghibelline, so siding with the emperors and backing them in his Mediterranean enterprise, mostly because they were opposed, in fact, to Sicily, and they wanted to try to seize it, fundamentally being backed by this German power. And therefore, what stands in the middle is Sicily. Now, how is that eventually the Sicilians decide to make this marriage with the Swabians and letting the Swabians inherit their own kingdom? So there was a dynastic crisis, fundamentally. The last Hauteville king, William II, who died in 1189, had remained without male heirs. The Hauteville dynasty had been ruling, in fact, consistently since the beginning of the 11th century, fundamentally in those areas, and had remained at this point. The favorite. Now, there was a problem, because technically speaking, albeit this being feudal kingdoms in which there was a sort of dynastic continuity in the inheritance of rule, there was still a sort of election that had to confirm the the king on his own, in his throne. This is true basically for all the kingdoms at this point, not because this succession was really much contested, but simply because in itself juridically, but simply because there were certain legal, let's say, there were certain aspects of this phenomenon for which there was always someone who was opposed to you. This was normal. They could find even the smallest excuse. Sometimes dynastic matters were very complicated. I mean, it just doesn't take, that you are son of your father, a legitimate son of your father, you inherit the throne, fundamentally. There are so many other... for instance, first of all, there is a family that is deeply intertwined. I mean, at this time, the European nobility was all together. There are, therefore, very important... also international issues. You need the backing, the support of this or that power. Unfortunately, we get this idea that, I don't know, here in the 12th and the 13th century, kingdoms were kind of confined, each one in their own sphere, that they didn't interfere with each other. This gloomy, restricted, narrow view of medieval politics, for which everything was local. The people minded only about their own local business, their local identity. It's completely bullshit. Europe was full international at the time. The political balances were all encompassing the whole continent. At this time, everything, especially with from the case of Sicily, was intertwined with the relation with the empire, of course, the relations that Sicily had with England. For instance, the father-in-law of William II of Sicily was nonetheless the King of England. The King of England was allied with the Welfen, so with the Saxon/Bavarian dynasty that opposed the Swabians, because England traded extensively with northern Germany at that point, and they had this interest in common. Were developing also important trade interests with the Baltic traffics, etc. Therefore, there were also naturally other internal problems. There were always certain there were illegitimate sons, for instance. The main opposer, eventually, of Henry VI of Hohenstaufen to the rise of the throne of Sicily was Tancred of Lecce, who was Count of this Apulian city that was actually an illegitimate nephew of the same William II. So most of them, there were many bastards, for instance, that were kind of had nothing to lose. There was the main problem. I would say the main problem of the monarchy at this point that really probably even kind of motivates deeply the German marriage was the barons, the internal nobility, the nobility of the kingdom. These barons had been always kind of a pain in the behind for every kingdom, for every king in every monarchy in Europe. You can see that quite clearly from France, from England. In Sicily it was pretty much the same. Doesn't matter how much the Siculo-Norman monarchy was centralized, how much bureaucracy they had developed, also inheriting from pre-existing Muslim and Byzantine models. Doesn't matter how wealthy they were. There were lots of problems internally, because the system of the kingdom was still feudal. There were all these barons fundamentally that controlled locally this or that county, that equated to lots of land that was concentrating into their own hands that they could use against to revolt. The same kingdom of Sicily had always been... The kingdom of Sicily, as I was saying, was created in 1130 by Roger II, who was also the father of Constance of Hauteville. This is remembered as the greatest Norman king in southern Italy. And the and this was the point, because in 1130 the kingdom, let's say better, of Sicily had been extended also to the peninsular territories of Italy. Up to that point, Sicily had been a county. So fundamentally, southern Italy at that point was kind of a sum of properties that the Hauteville had put together, but it wasn't kind of an overlordship over this land. By the way, the Normans had been expanding towards central Italy as well, on the Adriatic coast. They, as we've seen, they were kind of expanding. They were launching offensives in today's Albania against the Byzantines, even into Greece, and so on. They controlled also parts of the northern African coast, etc. And the kingdom had been created at this point based on Sicily, and extended this kingship all over the rest of also peninsular territories. The Normans were ruling from Palermo in the north of Sicily, where their court was, where their capital was. Eventually, historically speaking, after the Normans, the capital was shifted towards Naples. Also, that happened under the Angevins. Then the Angevins lost Sicily to the Aragonese, who make of Palermo sort of capital once again, but there is a brutal decline of Sicily, generally speaking, in that period. At this time, instead, Sicily is the center. It's really the most, very well organized, wealthy, florid, and so on. At least the Norman rule of Sicily is always remembered as kind of a positive thing. The only problem was that the southern Italian domains the peninsular domains weren't so happy about this lordship. There was, even if the barons that ruled into the peninsular domains were maybe the same part of the Hauteville dynasty, there were still lots of them who felt that Sicily was another thing. Also, geographically speaking, you can understand that aside from the Strait of Messina in the middle, but Sicily is kind of a fertile, hilly territory that, the interland is not very well accessible, but it's a kind of an easy thing to dominate on the coasts. It had communications are relatively easy, especially by sea. Southern peninsular Italy is kind of a mess because it's all mountainous fundamentally. There are very few coastal plants. There is this plateau of Apulia that is particularly fertile and relatively easy to control, and that's why also it became at one point, even in their one center. For instance, Frederick II was known as Poor Apulia because Apulia was his, not Sicily, I believe, was his favorite land in his kingdom, in his southern kingdom. But the rest of the peninsular domains were extremely difficult of access. I mean, the same Normans, when they subdued the territories, had done it at a very high cost. There had been certain communities that had even preserved their own autonomy for a very long time. After the conquest of Sicily, when the peninsular domains were theoretically already under the Hauteville from the initial conquests. And it was very difficult to go at war into these territories because you find these hilltops, these castles, these fortifications over the mountains. It was dramatic in terms of logistics and so on. Roger II had to fight continuously, practically, to subdue fundamentally these territories and to make them controlled, have to control them back from Sicily. And in general, the baronial revolts that were backed also by these other local communities that existed were the reminiscences of the Longobards duchies and of the south. There were this kind of general local interests that could be formed against the Sicilian rule, fundamentally, really geographically meant in this sense, as something detached from the peninsular territories. Well, these rebellions fundamentally went on intermittently throughout all the history of the Sicilian the Siculo-Norman kingdom. So this was a big problem, because you realize that, at a certain point the Byzantines in the 12th century had even invaded Apulia, that had managed to wipe out almost all the Norman avamposts from peninsular Italy, and the Normans from Sicily make it with a brilliant combined amphibious operation at Brindisi to kick out the Byzantines, to raze to the ground all the rebels. They even razed the whole city of Bari to the ground. It was technically, part of their own territory now that they had reacquired. So this gives you a dimension of the instability of power in a 12th, 13th century feudal kingdom. And if this is true for the Kingdom of Sicily, it was kind of one of the best ones, one of the strongest, one of the most centralized, one of the best administered. You can imagine what the situation was in the rest of Europe in many ways. So there is a big historiographical question at this point. Why is that William II decides fundamentally to leave the throne to the Germans by making his aunt actually marry with the heir of the Hohenstaufen fortune, Henry VI, that had already been raised, if I'm not wrong at that time, Holy Roman Emperor, or he was right around the same time, basically, by his father Frederick Barbarossa. So, first of all, I said his aunt, yes, because William II fundamentally was, if I'm not wrong, was son of William I, was son of Roger II. So Constance was the daughter of Roger II, and hence William II's aunt. And she was I don't remember when, an age comparison, but there was not much difference and she was actually relatively old when she married. This was also a problem because when she conceived Frederick II, she was like 40, and at that time, today women normally can make children at that age without much of a problem. At the time was something unbelievable. That's the reason why also Frederick, according to tradition, Constance staged her own labor publicly in a tent into this city of central Italy, where she gave birth to Frederick, where she was crossing to go back to Sicily at the time, because nobody believed that a 40 years old woman could give birth at the time. That was excruciatingly important because she was for dynastic reasons, because if that would have if this child was kind of a it was a fake, let's say, it was taken from someone else, this would have created enormous inheritance problems on legitimacy, etc. So that's the anecdote, that why she did such a thing, giving birth publicly to her son. So excuse me, I drink a little bit. So the question is why? Because you would think, the Normans had, after all, their own kingdom. They had their problems like anyone else, but this kingdom was still kind of functional. Why did they hand it to the Germans at this point? The question is, because you see, we have talked about Tancred of Lecce that eventually took arms even against this German Sicilian marriage. He was even an illegitimate Hauteville, if I'm not wrong. So there were pretendants within the barons that could, raise to the throne and therefore may succeed to the rule of Sicily as fundamentally locals, as people who knew what the business in the kingdom was. They came from this. This is particularly important also for another consideration you can make in the history of the Kingdom of Sicily, is that eventually the Kingdom of Sicily was ruled all by foreigners, by foreign dynasties, let's say better, because the local barons actually kept to rule, and this was the major problem for any monarch that was there. because especially after the Swabian period, the barons in the dynastic crisis that follow, the barons took so much land that eventually even the conquerors that arrived later had to negotiate their control of the area, and that remained always their problems. I mean, the Angevin and the Aragonese were extremely troubled by these problems, and in general these were decentralized rules. I mean, the Angevins I mean, they really transferred kind of everything into, especially Naples, where they chose as capital. But for the Aragonese, we talk already of vice kingdoms. We're talking about kingdoms and lands that are ruled from the distance, and therefore also increasingly negotiating with the power of these local barons that effectively in the history of this kingdom will always prevent the construction of a more solid settled rule in there and kind of manage things on their own. With the Normans, it hadn't been like that. I mean, the Normans had problems with the barons, but we are still into a phase in history where, you know, every single country had problems with the barons. But on the other hand, you find that in relative terms, exactly by these standards, the Norman kingdom had been something solidly centralized and especially ruled by a dynasty that was grounded in there. I mean, the Hauteville were not, let's say, Normans from Normandy anymore. They didn't depend on somewhere else. They had come there as mercenaries, as contractors. They didn't have any institutional tie. While the Anglo-Normans, for instance, technically were still tied to the French crown because they were, as dukes of Normandy, were vassals of the French king. The Sicilians were, the Siculo-Normans were fundamentally tied just to the papacy, and their land was Sicily, so that's where they ruled from. So there was this kind of internal dimension that is important to consider as a factor when thinking of handing a territory to foreigners, like the Swabians were, and with which the Normans basically had no tie, because Swabia is this region, into the very heart of continental Europe. It doesn't, the Normans had legitimately not ever had anything to do with it. So why was this? Well, this is still debated. There have been so many hypotheses formulated that is kind of there are not so many after all, but there are so many scholars that are still wavering that we don't have the answer proper. Certain scholars believe that this German-Sicilian marriage might have was in the air fundamentally from quite a time. The reasons are more difficult to ascertain. First of all, there is an idea that is the papacy. We have seen how the papacy was always in the middle, creating problems fundamentally and trying to. By the way, the Pope, it hadn't just nominally entrusted southern Italy feudally as a feudal concession to the Normans. It had always wanted its counterpart. The Church of Rome actually exercised a pretty strong control on the ecclesiastical estates of southern Italy. The popes, since the time of the late Roman Empire, had this obsession with southern Italy because theoretically, back in the day, they had created these enormous estates that belonged to them. I mean, properly to the Church of Rome, to the Bishop of Rome. And therefore, with all the promise that had happened, that bothered everyone that had been there to trying to recover these territories. First, the Byzantines, of course, that were not even so friendly with the papacy because they deemed it to be kind of a, they had to obey to Constantinople. The Pope wanted them to obey to Rome, so on. Then, especially in Sicily, because Sicily had, because of its fertility fundamentally, then Sicily is conquered by the Arabs. So this also, historically speaking, brings Rome, the Church of Rome, to abandon temporarily its Mediterranean horizon to say, okay, those lands are lost to the Muslims now, and that even brought, in fact, Rome to start building some properties into central Italy proper. I mean, that was a moment in history to which the popes grew strongly oriented towards a more clearly defined Italic dimension into the Apennine, into this area of the peninsula. Then with the Normans, they see, okay, finally we're going to recover Sicily. And in fact, what happens is that, of course, the Normans, seized these lands. They created the kingdom on their own, institutionally speaking. They bring all this French personnel from the north from Normandy. They reshape everything in a French model. If you essentially see what happens with the Norman conquest in Italy, is that the Normans spoke French. They wrote in French. They bring this kind of proto kind of Gothic characters typical of northern France and southern England. They're French at this point, and they organize everything also in the Western Frankish institutional models. Whereas the Roman Church gets a very strong control and lots of privileges into the Siculo-Norman kingdom regarding the management of the ecclesiastical properties, so that this was a bit of a problem, not so big, but still consistent for the Norman kings, because the Church of Rome always interfered directly into the internal affairs of the kingdom through the ecclesiastical, through the ecclesiastical channel. Fundamentally, there were bishops, archbishops. Southern Italy was full of it literally had hundreds and hundreds of dioceses. Into countries like Germany, dioceses were very few. In Southern Italy, you find hundreds, because that's partly, well, of course, Southern Italy was also more urbanized, was more populated, so that kind of also makes sense. But it was still also a matter of, in fact, the kind of the private mindset that the Pope had on these lands, and its approach in this fashion. They wanted to control, to draw as more profit as possible in many ways. So the anti-papal function is an option. I mean, the Normans said, okay, let's marry with the with the Holy Roman Emperors, so that we can strangle the Roman Church in the middle, in a pincer movement, because the Holy Roman Emperor technically rules over, say, at least formally, over Germany and Italy. We rule over Sicily. Rome is in the middle. They're done. This was the Pope's nightmare. I mean, literally, this is what the worst possible scenario that the popes, in fact, struggle till the very end, successfully, by the way, to avoid. This is particularly evident if you already know the story of Frederick II, or what the whole thing. Today we will address partly also this thing, this matter. But that was terrible, and in fact the Pope immediately showed and possibly this marriage with the Empire had been delayed exactly because of not upsetting excessively the papacy, because political balance at this time was kind of equilibristic, so even having the papacy radically against you would do most of the times more harm than good. So the Hauteville had kind of waited a little bit. There was also kind of another problem that we have hinted about before, was the fact that the Kingdom of Sicily at this time was allied with the Kingdom of England traditionally, and the Kingdom of England was allied in turn with the, as we've seen, with the Welfen, who were the bitterest rivals of the Hohenstaufen into Germany. So allying with the Swabians for the Hauteville would have created kind of a loss of support from the English crown, that coupled with the with the hostility of the papacy would have been completely unbearable. It would have isolated the Hauteville from the international stage. So these were factors that were kind of so-so. So we're not in the mind of William II. We don't know what kind of choice he made. But there is this aspect that is often overlooked. That kind of answers the question, why choosing a foreigner and not a local Siculo-Norman aristocrat? And the answer is probably exactly because of this, because they didn't want to give power to the aristocrats. They didn't want to give power to the barons. I don't know whether this is a kind of a good or bad interpretation, because technically speaking, if you're a baron that rises to the throne of Sicily, now you are not just a king of Sicily like your previous monarch, but you also have your own baronial properties. So this might have, technically speaking, on a sheer mathematical point of view, kind of increased and added to the power of the newly elected king in terms of internal control. At the same time, there were probably certain, internal dynamics that probably would have not made it so easy for one of the barons to rise over another, because the other ones would have said, oh, why is this guy getting elected? Why can't we? At the same time. So at the time, the Swabians were still kind of powerful. The Swabians, at this time, the ruler of the empire was still Frederick I. Was still Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick Barbarossa is an extraordinary figure. He was extremely resilient, determined. He was a very squared person in many ways, and in spite of all these massive difficulties and defeats, also Frederick had a kind of a relatively sad life, especially in his youth. He had always made it, and even after these defeats, he had found the strength to rise again in many ways. Even after the Battle of Leniano, that had brutally resized redimensioned the universalistic ambition of the Hohenstaufen, the Swabians had managed to kind of set well back things in order. In Germany, they managed to not to make their authority collapse. Even with the Lombards, they managed to obtain an agreement. With the Peace of Constance, the Italian communes didn't get. They hadn't been fighting in the first place for getting rid of the emperor. They just wanted fundamentally to keep doing what they wanted, not to pay all those taxes that the Germans were requiring them. They had fought the hard way. They had made it to win, but they didn't disconfess the emperor. It was absurd. The Italian communes thought of themselves at the time like any other political entity in Christianity, as framed into the Roman Empire, and they recognized the imperial legitimacy, also because this legitimacy could, in fact, at that point, once this authority could legitimate their own prerogatives at this point, the ones that they had fought for against the same authority. But that's the point. If you get an imperial diploma, it tells you that now you have those rights, and that the same emperor cannot touch it, theoretically at least, because theoretically the empire still remained capable of deciding on certain matters autonomously, but it was a matter of political balance, and now the balance had been favorable to the Lombard League, not to the emperor. It was kind of a profitable thing to do, and the same Italian communes had to kind of profit from the imperial policies and so on. So it was fine. So there was an equilibrium that was more or less re-established. At this point, obviously you understand from the Swabian side the enormous interest of marrying the last heiress of the Norman kingdom of Sicily. So what the Hauteville probably thought at that time was saying, that the Swabians had this kind of still substantial power that could work into Sicily to fundamentally frame the barons into an institutional order. If they had chosen an internal baron, the kingdom would have been engulfed into a civil strife between all these various barons now. If the Swabians had arrived, it has still a consistent military power, they would have ordered them, they would have disciplined them, and the legacy of the empire would have, of the Siculo-Norman kingdom of the Hauteville would have continued, dynastically speaking. It's very difficult for us, I believe, to understand the importance of the dynastic legitimacy of this, and the dynastic mindset overall of these monarchs. I mean, the idea that it's not really about what language your people speaks or what its customs are. The important thing is that there is a strong leader in there that is put in there exactly to defend the rights, the law, and the security of that population. Nobody cared whether these dynasts were foreigner or not. Unfortunately, our mindset is so deeply affected by the 19th century nation-state idea, for which we think, a foreigner is something incompatible with the local. No, at the time, it wasn't like that. Any king was fine, especially if it had, now it's complicated because in the Kingdom of Sicily now it's not the case, but take Germany itself. Germany at one point after the end of the Hohenstaufen starts electing kind of external emperors, because the German princes think in this way they can do whatever they want, because these foreigners do not have enough power into Germany proper, because they're rulers of other countries fundamentally, and they can't reach Germany effectively. Well, here it's a bit the reverse. Here it's possible that the Hauteville chose the Swabians exactly because they were kind of a relatively, not such a close power, but I mean Italy could be crossed relatively quickly, and the transition of the Siculo-Norman kingdom into Swabian hands could happen in a relatively safe, secure way. Relatively. Because what happens, and this was, so this may be the reason. That's why Henry VI, son and co-emperor with Frederick son of and co-emperor with Frederick I Barbarossa, marries in 1186 the daughter of the Norman king Roger II, Constance of Hauteville, aunt of the last king of Sicily, and a true Hauteville. She was Constance was was daughter of Roger II and a French, actually a German, I think a German princess, however, a Lorrainese princess. It was also, it had relatives with the Zeringa in Alsace, also with Nassau, so all this area that also was relatively close to Swabia. There were certain interests also from this point of view, and there were also many legions. The fact that she was, there also Dante recalls that she was in a monastery at this time, that she didn't want to marry, and eventually the raison d'etat brings to the marriage with Henry VI. Henry VI was kind of the sources describe him as a kind of a smart man. He was relatively thin, not extremely strong. He was not extremely also much into military affairs at this time. Obviously, every king had a very strong also military character, so he was a knight. But he was more of a thinker than more a politician than a soldier, than a warrior fundamentally. But he was still an effective person. And now the story is enormously complicated. Maybe one day we will get into detail on how all the problems now. Henry VI was also excommunicated at one point, was fighting against certain bishops in Germany. It was all a great fight into this process. but specifically in Sicily, this gave rise to a revolt. Because enormous diplomatic success of the Hohenstaufen, having married the last heirs of Sicily, but now the Siculo-Norman barons weren't very happy about this, and they rise. They were the troubles went relatively down relatively quickly, because the rebellion was led by Tancred of Lecce, as we've seen. That was also named. He had himself crowned king of Sicily in Palermo, but eventually died. Henry VI manages to defeat all the opposition with arms into the kingdom of Sicily. So actually, the transition goes on relatively easily. Constance at one point is even kidnapped by Tancred. She manages to escape. Also a relatively dramatic situation, but it can, at the end of the day, the Hohenstaufen make it, so that Henry VI becomes king of Sicily. This happened in the end of the war was actually arrived in 1194, so it was relatively for a long time, because the marriage had been consumed, in fact, in 86. The last Siculo-Norman king being still alive, William II, dies in 1189. So it's after 5 years that finally Henry VI manages to go to Palermo and to be crowned king of Sicily. Interestingly enough, this happened on December the 24th, 1194. Usually crownings were done on Christmas Eve usually, and 2 days after, on December 26, 1194, it's a very famous day because Frederick II is born in Jesi. Constance is in coming back to the kingdom of Sicily, and along the way she gives birth to their first son. So Henry VI rules for only 3 years on the kingdom of Sicily, because he eventually dies prematurely in 1197. He dies of illness, and relatively quickly. Nobody ever malignated he was killed in any way, but it was normal for the time to die so easily. And he had a pretty intense life at this point, because because of also the matters with Germany, fundamentally. He had been, as we've seen, he had been associated by his father to the throne of the empire, and his father had died during the Third Crusade in 1190. So now he was the only emperor at this point, and his death is a very dramatic event, because it's remembered also historiographically speaking, from especially the history of the Holy Roman Empire, as a sort of terrible shame and of a disaster, a tragedy, because at this point the empire remained without a head. Frederick II, so he, as we've seen, Henry had his first-born son, Frederick II, and therefore the sort of dynastic succession would be was auspicable for at least for the Hohenstaufen to continue their rule into the Holy Roman Empire. Especially now that, in fact, both the Swabians and the Hauteville had made this big thing of having united dynastically their respective domains, and therefore having created one of the greatest, if not the greatest, definitely at that point, power in Europe, formally speaking. So on Frederick II were reposed all the hopes of the various of these two, chiefly of the Hohenstaufen now, because the Hauteville dynasty had extincted. By the way, Constance died, as a matter of fact, in 1198, so just 1 year after her husband. This was also another kind of dramatic eventuality. So the main problem now was having Frederick succeeding once again to his parents. Actually, the Swabians had not remained without other heirs. One of Henry VI's brothers, Philip, had remained as Duke of Swabia and was fighting in Germany actively against the Welfen in order to recover the monarchy. To be elected now after Henry VI, because let's remember, the German monarchy was always elective, so at this point it was a matter of fighting. It was the usual problem of using arms and diplomacy in order to be elected. But now there was also a major problem, because that was represented by the papacy. Why? Because the papacy actually didn't react negatively to this marriage. I mean, the papacy could simply say, I don't know, this marriage is invalid for some reason. But eventually, there were no legal basis for opposing the marriage of these two entities. We've seen how the Pope was. We're strangely we lack effectively informations about what the papal reaction was towards the marriage of Henry and Constance. Simply know it went unopposed. So the papacy, at least formally, had not opposed this marriage, but it was evident, as we have explained, that the sum of these dynastic possessions was a great threat for the Church of Rome, being now threatened to be, by both the German Empire and the Kingdom of Sicily. And the main aim of any, especially of the Holy Roman Emperor, was naturally that now had kind of secured historically the imperial title for itself in this German chunk of Christianity, was to rule over Rome in order to influence the papacy and to fundamentally elect popes who would in turn crown whichever emperor they wished. So this was the real risk. It went beyond now. It wasn't just a matter of purely political matters, because also Central Italy now was a pretty consistent part of territory that by controlling Rome could be acquired. The popes now, since several centuries, had been slowly and patiently been building this the control over the central Italian lands, and they were still struggling for this. This is something that they had requested formally even to the same imperial authority back at the time of Charlemagne, by saying, okay, we as popes, we want this amount of land into Italy. Initially, I think the popes asked something like everything that went literally down from the from northern Italy to the Strait of Messina. Obviously, no emperor even took seriously this request, but the papacy had quite skillfully managed, in fact, to carve this power on its own, exploiting exactly these divisions and putting one power one against the other. In the same, Holy Roman Emperors and Normans had been, for evident geographical reasons, the major actors on which the papacy had played up to this point. So naturally, we can expect the papacy to have been kind of glad of the death of both of Henry and of Constance, because at this point, especially Henry's death, opened to Constance's death, obviously opened to the fact that she couldn't have children anymore. But of course, Henry might have remarried, but Henry in fact had died before Constance, and this opened his death in general to the successory crisis in Germany. So naturally, the Pope always also played in the German election, if anything, because the would-be emperor had necessarily to become to be crowned to the the elected king of Germany had to be crowned eventually by the Pope in order to become emperor. So this is really what mattered at that point. But there was also this other, relatively thorny aspect of their actually the only children of Henry and Constance, that was Frederick. Frederick, as the son of these two monarchs, had been loaded with enormous expectations by his parents. There is this legend, which is, I think it's late, but it nevertheless fits well into the general mindset of the time, that Frederick was meant to be called Constantine by his parents. Henry VI also insisted for Frederick to be baptized by the Pope, albeit Constance had him baptized in Jesi, where he had been born. So there was this idea that laid under the general universalistic mindset of the time, that now Frederick was sort of a chosen person, just in all the prophecies and all the fact also he was born one day after the alleged day of birth of Christ on December the 26th, so that he would have to become a sort of next Christ, Christ having born on December the 25th. Now he was a sort of continuer, the idea that also there would have had to be a last emperor that would have had to bring Christianity back again under the control, to rule over the world, that he would have had to reconquer the holy places, because there was this prophecy that the last emperor would have recaptured Jerusalem, that now had fallen into the hands of the Egyptians. And all these general prophecies that also contributed to build the myth of Frederick II eventually, and given the figure that he was to become. But just for saying that as soon as he was born, Frederick was hoped to be really a great, was meant to become a great ruler as son of this, as heir of this massive fortune of the Swabian and the Siculo-Norman domains. His name, Frederick, was called after they wanted to call him either Frederick or Roger, so he respectively as his grandfathers, Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, or Roger II, King of Sicily. They chose eventually Frederick. And in 1198 he was only 4 when he lost not just his father back in the day, but also his mother now. So this child was an extremely important political pawn at that point. His uncle was ruling in Germany as Duke of Swabia and fighting for the German crown. He was still a kid, and he needed a tutor, fundamentally. Constance, before dying, unexpectedly had already provided him with a sort of protection in this self-tutelage. Frederick was meant to become actually both, at that time, actually only King of Sicily. That was saved, and the succession naturally was to the ducal throne of Swabia was kind of what they had to see, because maybe at that time, of course, in line he had to become when he would have reached would have come to age, he would have to be legally also Duke of Swabia. For now, was his uncle that was ruling in his place, more or less in his place. I believe more, for himself, but nevertheless, at this time, just to make you understand, everything was could change really from a moment to another. So even this thinking over time was not. But the most important thing at this point was that theoretically, had Philip died, which happened, by the way, because he was assassinated by the Wittelsbach, and Frederick was de facto the only heir that had to follow on his father's footsteps, and also inheriting, as a Holy Roman Emperor, and also inheriting the Kingdom of Sicily that now belonged to him, because there were no other legitimate, requests, legitimate claims, to the Sicilian throne. So Constance, in order to grant successfully, at best at least, the succession to the Kingdom of Sicily, she had entrusted Frederick, her son, to the tutelage of the Pope Innocent the Third. Now, Innocent the Third, as you know, is one of the most important popes in the history of the Roman Church. He was an extraordinary figure. I made only a video about him, but I will have to go back on him so very often, because he's one of those key figures that you could never stop talking about. The video made is the Pontificate of Innocent III, a later son of the Counts of Segni. He was an extraordinary figure, and it's during his pontificate that the Roman Church reaches his greatest earthly power, fundamentally. At this time, the Roman Church, under Innocent III, really controls literally all the kings of Western Christianity. He had an enormous power. There were also several dynastic contingencies, including this one that we have just explained, that brought him to be so extremely influent. So we have no time for explaining, but just thinking about the Albigensian Crusade, about intervention also into English affairs. It's plenty of elements that, and especially now we will see the intervention in the German affairs that also was so radical. But what we mostly care about is to remind that now the kings of Sicily were vassals of the Church of Rome. So Constance had managed to secure Frederick's succession to the throne, entrusting him to the protection of the Pope. So the Pope was a sort of an adoptive father for Frederick, and naturally Innocent thought, rightfully, to make of Frederick a sort of perfect son of the Church that would perfectly obey the papacy, and therefore pursuing the universalistic dreams of the Church of Rome, that also weren't that difficult from the one of the same Holy Roman Emperors, as the Roman Church now had, as we've said, an enormous secular power as well. I mean, real power in secular affairs, and could see, paradoxically, the same union of Germany and Sicily as a perfect mean to extend also the power of the Church through these channels, and therefore making Frederick fundamentally obeying to the Church. And there was also the project of crusade, etc. In fact, Frederick was fundamentally raised, also if you see in his youth, when he started to, when he came of age and started to have an active role into political affairs, etc. His first steps were all directed, in fact, towards this perfect following also the papal directions, and together also with imperial grandeur. But this is, we will see it now. So the the minority of Frederick II was also exploited, however, by Innocent III to obtain more direct and immediate benefits. Given that he exploited this situation for acquiring and to strengthen his dominion, the dominion of the temporal dominion of the Roman Church over those lands of central Italy that fundamentally had been contested historically between the Church of Rome and the Empire. These were the regions of Umbria, the Marches, and Romagna, so also partly in northern Italy. These were kind of, altogether were kind of a big chunk of the peninsula, and were, very important because they controlled fundamentally the passages also of the Apennine from the north to the south, also to the Kingdom of Sicily from the north. So this had also a very specific strategic meaning for the eventual inheritance of for the connections, let's say, that between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Sicily in terms of communications. And these were lands that had always been contested because the Pope was was not powerful enough to seize them directly. Even at this time, the real control of these areas was pretty much weak. The popes basically achieved full control in these areas only into the late Middle Ages, and always in a relatively decentralized fashion up to a certain point in history into the modern age. So the Holy Roman Emperors could say, okay, these lands fundamentally belong to us. But the popes would obviously use their ideological weapons. They would excommunicate them. Obviously, the main problem was not really these lands of central Italy, but the general imperial policy and so on. But these lands were part of the discord fundamentally between the popes and the emperors. Naturally, these were lands that were fundamentally they would actually be they were contested chiefly when the emperors came into Italy, because obviously the Pope was much closer to them. It could have a more direct influence, but naturally when the emperors came back to Italy episodically, they would ask naturally for these lands back. This is also important to explain because excuse me, I drink a little bit. Because also in here perhaps there is a sort of schematical perception of what the Papal States really were. The Papal States were called at this time Patrimonium Sancti Petri, which means literally the asset of St. Peter, the property of St. Peter, patrimony, in fact. So this patrimony was something that, as all medieval patrimonies fundamentally, was extended on a very heterogeneous amount of lands that weren't of properties in general. They weren't even necessarily corresponding to these districtuations that more or less existed, historically speaking, were created by the empire or pre-existed in some way, and that went beyond, in fact, even for the church. I mean, the church was owning them as secular lords. I mean, look at even the pact that they had with Normans back in the day. They had done it obviously under the the divine for divine mandate, let's say, and so on, but it was fundamentally a feudal relation like any others that had existed. So this patrimonium was not really pretty cohesive. So these lands of Umbria and Marches and Romagna were fundamentally not entirely, I mean, there were lands over which the church claimed power, but it's not that it really existed in there, that for some reason they were part of that. I mean, these were lands. Medieval power couldn't control literally everything, so most even these fights were about claims over certain contested territory, so that you maybe couldn't control it fully, like occupying it militarily speaking, but you could, for instance, sending legates or other officials and functionaries, etc., to maybe collect the taxes, because eventually that was where all the power in medieval times got down to. I mean, in terms of economical resources, and that was really the point. These lands had to pay either to the Pope or to the Emperor, or to both, and in the chaotic, administrative mess of lack of centralization that existed into the Middle Ages, these were all problems that were extremely fluid. They could change really very frequently. The popes eventually obtained these 3 regions from, officially from the emperors back in, I don't remember really when. I think it was the 70s, maybe in 1274. I don't remember. It was under Habsburg. It was under Rudolf of Habsburg. So when the Hohenstaufen had vanished fundamentally, and now the empire was kind of restructuring itself on a more strictly German base, the Habsburg now was allied of the Pope. It didn't have means to get into Italy like his predecessors, and he simply obtained, papal legitimization through giving back this, officially leaving these lands by imperial authority or by King of the Romans, because actually Rudolf of Habsburg was never Holy Roman Emperor, to the Pope. So that would become the natural route of expansion of the Roman Church. It was kind of normal, because these were Apennine lands mostly. Romagna was more like of a flat land in the Po Valley, etc. But it's these were areas that were relatively difficult to get into, and it was difficult for the Pope, but at the same time were lands where nobody really went expanding. So the Pope could do it bit by bit, and kind of achieving results that in those lands would have not been contested by many other competitors. So that's why. So during this time of lack of authority, of imperial authority, this was a very good way to expand into these territories, because this also was the medieval political and military practice. As long as there is a vacuum of power, everybody basically fills it as much as they can, seizing and confiscating and acquiring and stealing. There was a great problem. Also, that's why the premature death of Henry VI was so important, historically speaking, because if he had lived and he had put an order to the empire, he could have ensured, in fact, his son also a much greater power. I mean, the Hohenstaufen might have, in spite of all difficulties of the previous centuries, might have, in the 13th century, really created and really made it. They could have restored really the Western Roman Empire and even conquered Constantinople. The same Henry VI had gone, together with his father, extremely close to capture Constantinople itself with his army. So this was all feasible at the time, and they were trying to work hard in order to achieve it. This is really the dynamism of medieval times. Instead, the premature death of Henry in 1194 and opened to these decades of lack of a strong power, because as we will see, the Innocent III eventually had Otto of Brunswick elected, and he was not as powerful as the Swabians. And guess why he did it? Because obviously he didn't want the Swabians to become too powerful. So by that time, he had elected, he had tried to reduce the Hohenstaufen's power in that fashion. At the same time, he, however, respected Constance of Hauteville's wishes and promises, and to her, and in 1208, Frederick became, in fact, when he came of age at 14, Innocent III had Frederick elected King of Sicily. Naturally, the situation was much more complicated than it seems, because Frederick at this time actually was raised into Palermo in Sicily, and he was entrusted to formally to certain German noblemen that had come with his father into Sicily, and to which his father had entrusted the control of the land. After the having crushed the baronial rebellions, Henry VI had distributed this estate, the local estates, to some of his German aristocrats that had fought with him into Sicily. And this, when Henry died and Constance died, basically the Kingdom of Sicily went in anarchy, because this German noblemen did whatever they liked. Frederick was entrusted formally to the Anweiler, Markwald, if I'm not wrong, Anweiler, and who also in there controlled roughly only Sicily. The peninsular territories were controlled by other. And Markwald of Anweiler was actually a terrible man, at least what we have. I don't know. Of course, I don't want to say things about people I don't know personally, but this is at least the idea we get from the sources. Obviously, these people didn't really care about Frederick, the young Frederick, in any way. Frederick grew old into this into this very stimulating multicultural environment of Palermo. Literally in the city streets, and developing a very strong character and so on. And only very progressively he managed, especially through the support of the Bishop of Palermo, to basically rise when he came to age, and to trying to get rid of these noblemen, and to also contrast Otto of Brunswick that now we will see what he did against him. Because Innocent III had fundamentally, we said it, he had backed Otto of Brunswick during the German election against Philip of Swabia. As a matter of fact, Philip of Swabia has been eventually got assassinated, so this paved the way further to the expansion of Otto's power into Germany. This was unexpected by Innocent, and so Otto of Brunswick was a representative of the dynasty of Bavaria. So and also actually of the that the Hohenstaufen and the Welfen were actually intertwined. They were they were relatives as well. So this was also the new dynastic order that Germany was taking. The Hohenstaufen, especially since Frederick I had stressed this, trying to surpass this very divided system, fragmented system of the old so-called ethnical duchies, to build paradoxically a more unifying factor through a feudal system that imported from France, fundamentally, where it was developed at its extremes. And the Otto of Brunswick fundamentally was the son of Henry the Lion, was cousin of Frederick Barbarossa. So Henry the Lion, as you remember, if you can hear also in those videos I made about, in fact I mentioned before about Frederick I and Henry the Lion, had fundamentally contrasted. Frederick, there was a war, also the House of Saxony was deprived of its domains, and they stem originally from Bavaria, but now I think their main center of power was legitimately Saxony, because they had inherited it from, if I'm not wrong, Henry the Lion's mother, and now it was mostly Saxony as their center of. And the Pope had backed Otto, had been crowned emperor in 1209. This is important because certain German monarchs were elected just as king of Germany and then kings of the Romans. The title of king of the Romans was essentially this half ground that basically was indicating you were Holy Roman Emperor in spe. That were fundamentally you had been fully accepted because it required a further crowning. Usually, the kings of Germany were elected in places like Mainz or Frankfurt am Main, and the kings of the Romans in Aachen, to stress the Carolingian legacy. And he was elected, as a matter of fact, Holy Roman Emperor, as Otto IV. As the last one was Otto III, one of the last Ottonians. And there was, however, some condition for that Innocent had presented Otto in order to make him elected, because he asked him explicitly, which also reveals pretty eloquently the fears of the papacy, Otto not to ever reunite the Kingdom of Germany with the Kingdom of Sicily. As we've seen, Otto had no actual claim on the legitimate claim on the Sicilian throne, which would need a further explanation, because as we've seen, Frederick was the legitimate heir, dynastically speaking, in terms of feudal law. Now, the problem is that the imperial thing had got in the way, because even Henry VI, when he had negotiated the marriage with Constance, with the Pope, had pretty much stressed, in order to acquire his wife's dowry of the kingdom itself, as a matter of fact, this ancient privilege that theoretically the Holy Roman Emperors had on southern Italy. Now, this was a pretty foggy thing, because in fact the Holy Roman Emperors never had quite of an illegal legitimization for a prerogative to rule over southern Italy. I mean, theoretically, the Universal Empire could, and there had been naturally moments in which the Holy Roman Emperors, we've seen it before, under the Ottonians especially, had ventured and conquered even some territory into southern Italy, but southern Italy as a whole had never belonged legally to them. Formerly it was lands of the Longobards that the Franks had tried to conquer, because southern Italy was still part of the Lombard kingdom, and it's a part that, however, the Franks didn't manage to subdue after they crushed the kingdom in the north. There were Byzantine territories. That was theoretically Roman land, Roman Empire. The Byzantines were still there when, a very few time before the Normans had, when eventually the Normans came and had conquered that land. And in the 12th century we have seen it. The Byzantines even tried under Manuel I Comnenus to invade southern Italy, to take it back once again. Sicily had been conquered by the Muslims from the Byzantines, and now it had been reconquered in arms by the Normans, legitimated by the papacy. So what about the Holy Roman Emperors? Basically nothing. No Holy Roman Emperor had ever set foot into Sicily, militarily speaking. So, however, Henry VI was stressing this idea that, however, those were lands that ideally pertained to the Western Empire in some way, over which the emperor had some sort of authority, which is very interesting, especially in comparison to what Constance of Hauteville thought like. We have some of her thoughts about this matter, and Constance as heirs of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. Instead, was extremely firm on the dynastic prerogative. She stressed that that it was thanks and only thanks to her dowry, to her inheritance, that she had brought the kingdom to her husband, fundamentally. So she was stressing perfectly the Norman version of the story. That is, we have conquered as Normans that land, it belongs to us, and now it just happens to pass through this Swabian ruler, because to the Holy Roman Emperor, because of the marriage. So it's just a dynastic thing. Now, Otto of Brunswick was, I'm not aware of this because I haven't read it, I should research this, but he was probably still stressing something like what Henry VI was claiming. Otto was kind of it was not really a secondary figure, but, historically speaking, at that point, it had been the Hohenstaufen who had ruled the political scenario in Germany. These were kind of the secondary family, the most important family in Germany after the Hohenstaufen, but they were kind of more, I don't even know how to say that, but they had less grandeur to back their own prerogatives. And now the real problem was that the Sicilian king was fragmented, as we've seen, was into relative chaos. So Innocent III had perfectly foreseen that Otto would try to acquire the kingdom of Sicily for himself as an imperial legacy, because it had been acquired by Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, by marriage. Now he had become Holy Roman Emperor in turn, so that belonged to. So you see here how complicated really was the story, and it was not even a problem, a strictly legalistic problem, because it was so important for the time to be legitimized ideologically speaking, exactly because it was difficult to actually control such faraway lands. But in this case, it was relatively easy for Otto to mount an expedition to go into Sicily and to try to recover it. I think, and so perfectly disobeying to Innocent III, that had granted him the Holy Roman Imperial crown, behind the promise, in exchange for the promise never to reunite Germany and Sicily. That was the papal nightmare. Instead, the first thing that Otto does is getting the crown and mounting up an expedition to southern Italy. Fantastic. So you can imagine Innocent III naturally was pretty much upset by this, and that's when the alliances shifted once again, because at that point the Pope felt betrayed, and he backed once again potently Frederick of Hohenstaufen's prerogative, especially now that Philip of Swabia also had been assassinated, and therefore there was this additional reason for delegitimizing Otto for what had happened, and so on. And this is particularly important because eventually it led to the... I mean, we don't really know what Otto would have done if he had behaved in a different way. What I think is worth of the mention is that the Mediterranean perspective was perfectly clear to everybody at the time. I mean, of all the historiographical debate that existed on the conveniency, let's say, of mounting up these expeditions into Italy from Germany, this was the main objective, the most convenient thing that could be possibly done. I'm saying this because I was reminding before the old German historiography stressed basically this dichotomy, for which basically the Swabians were the great kings, the great emperors, of course, but there were kind of dreamers as well. They were lured into this magic Mediterranean land by its promises, by the universal dream, etc. But they had neglected Germany, the German lands, while the Welfen family, so the Saxon-Bavarian branch instead had started to build from Henry the Lion onwards this true German, say, state, this German dimension, the fact that they had built the power into Saxony, the true harsh German land of the north. They had expanded the German lands east against the Slavs, so preluding eventually to the German expansion towards the east in the following centuries and so on, expanding into the Baltic Sea, creating also partly the favorable conditions for the Hanseatic leagues to develop. So a very northern German thing that had been created on the soil of what would become modern Germany, and that therefore was more preferable because it could have brought to a central national monarchy into Germany if it hadn't been for the Hohenstaufen that wanted to go abroad. Instead, I think that Otto of Brunswick is the perfectly brightest example that when the Welfen dynasty didn't venture into Italy and remain in Germany just because it didn't have an option. Because the Hohenstaufen were stronger, and surprise, surprise, when the Hohenstaufen now were so weak during the minority of Frederick II, guess what the Welfen do? They take their army from Saxony, from Bavaria, and they go straight into Italy and into the Kingdom of Sicily to seize it, and to create the empire from there. It's perfect. It was perfectly reasonable. It was really the most convenient thing of all. Trying what's better, to spend an enormous quantity of resources to try to curb Germany, that is a mess of territorial princes that are well rooted. Each one is in his own land. That is, by the way, harsh land, relatively poor land, still relatively wild and forested and marshy and relatively depressed. Or what do you want to go into Italy? On the sea, on the Mediterranean Sea, which is extremely rich, extremely well populated. It already has this centralized asset in Sicily with an institutional working administration, a state worth of this name that is there, open to you. Go to the south, go to the sun. That's what they did, and they were right. Especially now that there was a vacuum to fill. The Hohenstaufen had not. They had waged war at one point to the Normans, but even the Salians did it. But they hadn't made it to conquer anything in there. Now it was the right option, and especially now Otto had another reason, that was to get rid definitively of the Hohenstaufen heir, Frederick, and that could be achieved by seizing southern Italy and managing to, to kidnap, to kill, maybe not kill, but just look what happened with Conrad in Swabia after 50 years with Charles of Anjou. Eventually it ended like that. So dynastic matters were important because they legitimized in a world where otherwise there were not many other rules that could be practically followed, who was entitled to succeed to a single throne. So Otto was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1209. In 1210 he's excommunicated by the Pope. So just to tell you how quick this change really was, and how, let's say, relatively cunning Otto of Brunswick had been to promise to the Pope something he knew well beforehand he could not and he would not maintain, and getting, in fact, changing side. And at this point, in fact, the papacy, as we've said, started once again to back a new Swabian candidacy to the empire. That was, in fact, the one of the young Frederick II, that now was an adult formally because he was 14. that also was very important, legally speaking, that every sovereign at the time had to be fit physically, for age, so had to be capable in a way or in another. For instance, Frederick I's father was about to be elected, but he got wounded, and he lost one eye. And this was also this principle of physical integrity, that for which if you were lame or something, you couldn't succeed to the throne. So interestingly enough, when Otto of Brunswick invaded southern Italy, Frederick at that point had recovered some control in Sicily, and he even invaded Calabria, so getting into the peninsular side. He didn't have quite of a clear strategy at that point, but it was nevertheless a shout out to say, okay, I can't strike back, I can't deal with you, Otto. And that's how it happened, because in fact the Otto's efforts into southern Italy basically were vain. He didn't achieve much fundamentally, and he had to come back to Germany. Germany was a total mess. Everybody saw this occasion also when the emperor went abroad to rebel. There were so many problems into it, so it was always very, very tough to control. That's possibly also why the emperors wanted to get out of it, to create a state, to manage a kingdom that could be more ordered and, let's say, more reliable. And Frederick II at this point does one very courageous thing. He retakes fundamentally control of Sicily. Interestingly, Frederick was also extremely harsh in the way he achieved this. He was inflexible. There are some episodes that prove his iron fist. By the way, Frederick truly believed very strongly in his mandate. At the time, considered that every emperor felt himself invested, every monarch actually invested by God. Frederick had been raised with this, in spite of his uncontrolled upbringing. He had an extremely deep and strong sense of kingship in his veins. He was extremely proud of his own prerogatives. He really deeply felt his German and Sicilian legacy, and he also felt, in fact, son of the Pope. So he was at this time perfectly aligned with papal policy. In fact, what Frederick does is that he goes straight back to Germany, backed by the Pope, and in 1212, while Otto is in the north of Germany, Frederick has retaken control of the south from Swabia, and he's crowned King of Germany. Interestingly enough, also this time, however, this title was obtained by swearing to the Pope that the crowns of Germany and Sicily would have never been reunited. In the case of Frederick, it was relatively different, because at that point the Pope had legitimized him both for being King of Sicily and King of Germany, and eventually, as we will see, Holy Roman Emperor. That would happen 8 years later. But this dynastic union of the two crowns could happen only during Frederick's life. So the Pope granted to Frederick to have these two crowns reunited, but basically to always keep the business separated, and that that Frederick's successor could have not been legally possessor of the two kings, so could have not succeeded to the two kings. This is particularly interesting. Frederick had eventually several sons that they all made kind of a very sad end. But nevertheless, just think about also in here the problems of offspring. The idea that you can place your children on several thrones like it happened, you can control. Also for the sake of decentralization, Frederick II eventually would rule, even as Holy Roman Emperor and King of Germany, ruled mostly from Sicily, because that was the main base that was more profitable to administrate all these domains from. It was also closer to the Holy Land. It could reach it by sea. Was kind of an extremely faster way to move, and also safer by the 13th century than to go on land through all Italy, crossing the Alps, and into Germany. So kind of a Machinos thing, and with so many enemies along the way, by the way, because the Italian communes at this time were starting to reacquire certain ambitions that Frederick eventually wanted to stem. So, nevertheless, at this point, Frederick has achieved quite a freaking feat, because he has southern Germany and Sicily, and that's a hell of a power. And however, it's not over yet, because Otto is still very strong. By the way, it has the English backing, because the English are siding with the Welfen into Germany. Consequentially, since the English are at war, guess with whom? With the French. What a surprise! This was a very harsh moment of fight in northern France. The French king is allied with Frederick, with the Swabians. We can call him French King Philip II Augustus from this time, because he was the one that officially changed the name from Kingdom of the Western Franks into Kingdom of France proper. Philip II Augustus is a giant also into this phase of the Middle Ages. Is one of the greatest figures, together with Frederick I, Frederick II, Richard the Lionheart. Excuse me. And at this time, Philip II was also allied with the Pope, so there was this fundamentally the English plus the Saxons that would be, and the French and the Swabians backed by the papacy. At this time, really, also especially this phase is particularly interesting particularly crucial for the Kingdom of France. It was also the moment in which the Albigensian Crusade had been launched. Philip II took this opportunity to get rid of his own barons in France, his own noblemen, that just like in Sicily or any other feudal country, kingdom now were creating problems to the central authority. So he sends them to fight against the Albigensians in southern France. It was a terrible place to fight, and it was the Albigensian Crusade was a bath of blood, and all for very miserable results, at least on the short run. And very cleverly, and so he gets rid of his barons and instead fights against the English into northern France with mercenaries that, against any prejudice, as long as you have money, are actually more reliable than your own nobility. And the war with England was pretty harsh. The fate of Europe, the destinies of Europe were pretty much being decided at this point, because really of all these events that were happening in England, in Germany, in France, in Italy, everything could really change. They all had an effect on each other, and they were all depending on each other fundamentally. The situation is solved, famously speaking. I promise I will make a video on some French history that I'm kind of neglecting, unfortunately. It's only in 1214 that that actually the most important battle of the whole Middle Ages is fought. We're talking obviously about the Battle of Bouvines in Flanders, where the just remember that if you meet any person who tells you that the most important battle of the Middle Ages is something else but Bouvines, he's wrong. The Battle of Bouvines was truly the most important by any standard in terms of historical impact of consequences, fundamentally into history. Was that the most important one? Poitiers 732 doesn't get even close to that. It changed everything. It set up Europe fundamentally as we know it today. It triggered the Magna Carta. It triggered the rise of Frederick II. It triggered the rise of France as main continental power. It had a huge impact all over the continent. So in this battle, as you know, the Anglo-Germans are defeated by the French. That are also in here. It's pretty mixed because in the Anglo, in Otto of Brunswick army was backed by, there were even English troops sent by John Lackland, John I of England. There were Flemish mercenaries that, by the way, got butchered till the very end, foretelling what would happen in the 14th century. There were also certain northern French feudatories that were backing actively Otto of Brunswick against the French king, because they didn't want the French monarchy to strengthen and to go claim things on them. So the French, Philip II wins clamorously, and it's a battle that has so many meanings. It kind of opens the 13th century in this predominance of mounted combat, of cavalry, albeit even unchivalrous tactics were used on the French right. There was this kind of flank attack. It was considered unloyal for those at least ideals of the time, chivalric ideals of the times, and it sanctions fundamentally the predominance of the feudal elite, politically, militarily, socially. It opens to this great 13th century that is dominated by the French monarchy, its universalistic meanings, and Gothic architecture. Really, it's a really important chapter. Symbolically speaking, it's very important for Germany as well. When Philip II Augustus defeats the Anglo-Germans, he captures the Holy Roman Imperial banner of Otto of Brunswick, and he sends it to Frederick II. He restitutes it, he gives it back to him, by sanctioning fundamentally that the empire now belonged to Frederick. In fact, the wealth and power after Bouvines kind of collapsed, got sensibly weakened, and it would actually live on, but progressively would eventually turn into several other. The 13th century sees a lot of changes also in the internal balance of Germany, etc. But nevertheless, it's important because it gives the empire to Frederick. The Swabians win this clash. I made a video that is particularly meaningful about this, and it especially tells this story fundamentally. The name of the video is From Henry VI to Bouvines, The Struggle for the Empire. That's the video. I don't say very different things from the ones I said today, but the video concentrates on them more specifically. And 6 years later, Frederick II is also named and crowned. He's also crowned Holy Roman Emperor as well, definitely. So, and this opens to another story. I made some videos on Frederick II already. If you are interested, they're always they're in the Hohenstaufen playlist that I also mentioned before. And this is pretty much what I wanted to tell you today. There will be other considerations, naturally, that about this Sicilian inheritance in Swabian, generally in European history, that have an enormous meaning. But perhaps we will discuss them in another moment, because they're very complex, especially for the consequences that this brought to. So it's particularly important to have also more time to reflect on them more in a more dedicated way. So, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.